Hi, this is Jim Janossy. We're going to take a look at Unit Summary Form 1, that is USF1. This deals with the story of art, chapters 1 through 5. And the period of time we're talking about is all the way back from 30,000 BC to around 600 AD. We're going to take a look at several different civilizations or eras in this time, and for each we're going to examine what the purpose was of the art that era or civilization created, what rules were followed or imposed upon the people who created the art, what the technologies were that were involved, and what impact, if any, this artwork and these technologies had on modern life. Now, what I'm going to be looking for is the highlights of the facts for each of these eras or civilizations. An awful lot of facts exist in the assigned reading and the viewing for each of these eras and civilizations. But my intent here is to help you focus on just the big picture, the most important things, so that you have a way of combining this information, getting it into one place, collecting it together, so that the USF can serve as your factual resource for your reflective essay. And that's the main point of having a document in the workbook in printed form, so you can use it to take notes as you come across these facts in your readings and your viewings. So let's first of all take a look at Lascaux. What was the purpose of art, the cave art created by the Lascaux people? Well, we really don't know for a fact. We suspect it might be to honor animals or to work magic in some way to have some effect on these animals for future hunts, or maybe rites of passage for the hunters in the group as they matured, to provide some means of a rite of passage into full adulthood to join the other hunters. The rules, well, we can surmise the rules for much of this creation of art included the fact that the art had to look realistic, that the animal depictions were much as the animals really appeared. And this is where sophistication comes in. We were surprised when this artwork was discovered that very primitive people might have been able to create such sophisticated renditions of animals, and in different positions, even using the outcroppings of rock in the caves to give some three-dimensionality to the images. The colorants they had, when we get to technology, they appear to be natural earth colorants, that is, things that would be found, various minerals that might be ground up into a powdery form, probably bone or charcoal for very vivid blacks, and we're not really sure if they had any binders at all. Maybe water, maybe animal fat, maybe just rubbing these things on the cave walls themselves. We do know in these images of hands on the walls that some of the pigment was probably taken in somebody's mouth and spit out with their hand as a pattern, so that we got the silhouette of the hand that perhaps of the artist that created a piece of artwork. What is the impact on modern life? Well, not much. Until around 1939, or in one case in Lascaux, or in Altamira around 1880, it doesn't seem to have had much impact that we didn't know about this art, and after we discovered it, it seemed not to have very much impact either. We don't really know that there's any communication between those very ancient peoples and other civilizations that came later to have passed on any of their knowledge. It's just a big unknown because there was no written record of history at that time. It was prehistory. Let's take a look at a North African civilization that's documented for you only in one of the videos associated with Chapter 1 in the Story of Art. This North African civilization lived in the Sahara Desert. We really have very little information as to what they had in mind when they created scenes scratched on rocks of animals, and in some cases hunters, hunting scenes, maybe commemorating a hunting scene, or perhaps trying to control the outcome of some future planned hunt. Maybe one of the rules was make the animals recognizable and clearly distinguished from people. It does appear that they had a fairly good sense of how to depict animals and people in various poses and various types of actions. It once again looks like they use natural colorants, not combined with each other, and no apparent binder, just scratching these types of drawings on the rocks, in some cases exposed rocks, in some cases rocks in shallow caves. Now, as far as impact, well, one impact, given that climate change is a big topic of conversation these days, it's kind of interesting that these pictures document an era when the Sahara was lush and green. And that was maybe about 7,000 years ago. So it's an indication that climate change has occurred even without the kind of pumping of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that's occurred since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Climate change is probably a natural thing on Earth. We're not really sure exactly why the Sahara might have been very lush and green 7,000 years ago, and now is a very dry and hot desert. Let's take a look at the Egyptians. In the case of the Egyptians, we're looking primarily at tomb art. That is the art associated with the inner part of a pyramid where a sarcophagus was placed with the mummified body of a ruler, the pharaoh. One of the purposes of tomb art was to create an environment for the pharaoh's soul to live on. And in creating this art, it wasn't really intended that it was going to be viewed by anybody, because once the tomb was shut up with the mummified body in there, it was very dark, and nobody was in there. Nobody alive, anyway. So this art wasn't really intended to be viewed at all. It was obviously viewed before the entombment occurred, especially by the people who created it. But it wasn't really intended to be something viewed after it was put into use as the environment for the pharaoh's soul. A couple of rules that pop out from the readings in the story of art. Important people are drawn larger than less important people. The very largest are the rulers or the person being entombed, and decreasingly in size, people associated with that person, or at the very bottom of the hierarchy, slaves. People who were drawn in very small proportion compared to the most honored figure, the most important member pictured. Also, a very important thing here, that it wasn't the intent of the Egyptian artist, that is the craftsman who created this art, to picture things realistically. Now, they probably had some sense that what they were drawing is not the way your eye would see a person, for example. They drew these images for tomb art to capture as much information as possible. That means they felt, for example, that the chest was best displayed face on. You saw as much of it as possible. The face was drawn in profile, but if the eye were drawn in profile, you wouldn't see much of it. So they plastered the eye as if it were seen face on the side of the face, and it makes it look a little strange. The body being twisted sideways, the legs were extended, but you'll notice that both of the feet seem to have a big toe on the side that's facing the viewer, because that, once again, was more information. If it was an outdoor scene, for example, a pond, it would look as if you were viewing it from the air. You're looking down at it, but the fish or the ducks on it would be drawn sideways, as if they were floating sideways, and the trees surrounding the pond would be drawn flat out, as if they were laying on the ground. This was done because that provided the most information about those objects. It wasn't intended to be realistic. About the technology. Obviously, the pyramids are massive building and sculpture projects, and that reflects the ability to organize large quantities of material and labor. Also, to use geometry in a way that would create structures that had a regularity for some purpose. And we're not really sure what the purpose is. We think the pyramids were laid out in the belt in the constellation Orion. One pyramid a little bit displaced from a straight line. The constellation had some particular significance for the Egyptians. We don't really know why the pyramids were at the slope that they were built, or the massive size. We do know that the Egyptians pioneered beyond the prehistoric peoples in the use of colorants. They would mix various kinds of natural materials and heat them and create new colors by doing this. What is the impact of Egyptian art on modern life? Well, To some extent, it has introduced some types of designs that are characteristically Egyptian and well recognized for that purpose. But the detail provides a lot of information about life in the Egyptian times. The detail that's built into the pictures, for example, lets us identify various species of birds, some of which still exist, because they're drawn in such a detailed manner. Now let's take a look at the Sumerian civilization, about 3000 BC. This is documented only in a video that's assigned viewing, associated with Chapter 1 in the Story of Art. It's not covered in the text itself, the Story of Art. What was the purpose of art for the Sumerians? Well, one thing we can say, since they created figurines in clay for use in a temple, is probably temple decoration or perhaps deities. In some way, these figurines were important. One of the rules was the figurines seemed to have been proportioned accurately, much as people are proportioned, and they appear to be lifelike and dressed in the way that people at the time dressed. This gives us a little information about the Sumerians. In terms of technology, they were limited to mud structures and clay. Much of this didn't survive because of the fragility of these materials. But very importantly, the Sumerians invented the wheel, and they actually invented the arch. And both of these have a major impact on later civilizations. As far as technology also, they invented writing, beginning first with designs carved on a cylinder that could be rubbed across clay, a cylinder seal, so that the impression that was made in the clay in a way notarized things. It identified the person sending this because only that person would have possession of that particular cylinder seal, which would be a rather difficult thing for somebody to forge or to copy. The Sumerians, it appears, also invented agriculture in the sense that they irrigated fields and cultivated grains. And this development was really very important because once civilizations learned how to do this, they could plan on at least enough food, maybe an abundance of food, so that not everybody had to be engaged in the production of food or seeking it out. This meant time existed then the luxury of creating art, for example, or other types of recreation. This made it possible for civilizations to evolve art, which in fact is a luxury because it doesn't materially contribute to the production of food. Unless, of course, the civilization feels that by creating the art they're somehow placating a god who has some control over whether it rains or whether animals are plentiful or they can find enough food growing naturally. The impact of the Sumerians is primarily in the area of the wheel and the arch. The arch has been adopted by many civilizations in later days to form an element of large structures, and obviously the wheel has had tremendous impact in transportation. A little confusing perhaps is they also used the pottery wheel. That may have been their invention, but that version of the wheel is, although important for pottery making, it doesn't have nearly the impact as the wheel for transportation does on future civilizations. Now let's take a look at the Assyrians. They're documented a tiny bit in the video that talks about Mesopotamia and the Sumerians. They're documented to a greater extent in a video associated with the second chapter of the Story of Art. The important thing about the Assyrians was that they used art to portray their victories in a way that made the conquest of an enemy overwhelmingly apparent. They showed the Assyrians dominant, the people that they were fighting in woefully bad shape. They didn't show any of their own troops dying or suffering. They made the point that they were overwhelmingly victorious. This is actually a form of propaganda carved in stone. And one of the impacts of that civilization on modern life is that we still use propaganda as a means of biasing what people think, especially in conflict situations. So that's one of the most important impacts of the art of the Assyrians. Let's take a quick look at the Persians, a major civilization in ancient times that for some reason hasn't been mentioned at all in the Story of Art. and I think that's kind of a significant omission. The Persian Empire was very extensive, was eventually conquered by the Greeks, but in its heyday, it controlled an awfully large territory, and one of its rulers, Cyrus the Great, is even mentioned in the Bible because when he conquered the Babylonians, he freed the Jews to return to Israel. And for that, he's mentioned very favorably in the Old Testament. The purpose of art in the Persian Empire many times was to depict the strength of the empire by depicting fierce animals associated with it, and perhaps the king slaying some fierce animal, indicating that the king had great power even over those powerful beasts. The Persians used glazed brick, gold, and gilded silver images, carved rock, and wall reliefs. But they were also very famous for leaving their impact for modern civilizations on their innovations in city planning and infrastructure like canals and sewers. Their major cities had developed infrastructure that wasn't matched until the time of the Roman Empire later on, and they paved the way for cities to have these kinds of improvements that made for a greater degree of sanitation and civilized life. We're going to look at the Greeks and the Romans. First, the Greeks then. What was the purpose of their art? Well, to some extent, it was to honor deities. They created figures that were taken to be the deity, housed in temples, that is, massive stone temples. They also created idealized beauty in their sculptures. That is, they depicted humans in ideal form, not necessarily as real humans appear. Now, they may have made figures or statues of real people, but more commonly, they made statues of people who didn't exist, but were thought perhaps to exist in the form of gods, and they idealized these by making the best possible features, perhaps, that they saw from a collection of people and combining them in one piece of art, some type of statuary. They had excellent knowledge of human anatomy to be able to create these sculptures of idealized beauty. They also used the proportions of the golden mean in designing building features, and one of the videos that you see connected with the golden mean illustrates how they used the golden rectangle many times over for the windows and openings and shape of temple buildings. And they invented specific column types that standardized what people thought is dignified. What you really need to do is to be able to identify those three column types, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, be able to tell them apart. The technology included the technique of foreshortening, which is illustrated in the story of art in connection first with an image on a vase, a piece of ceramic artwork, where somebody facing you, unlike with the Egyptian artwork where they might be facing you but their legs would be turned sideways, their legs are face on. And all you see of the foot is little round things where the toes are, because you're just seeing the end of the toes. That's kind of important because this is the first use we see of artwork created as the eye sees an object, rather than knowing what's there and depicting it in the sort of blueprint form that the Egyptians did. One of the impacts of the Greek artwork is that architects still use the Greek temple facade and columns and ornamentation for buildings that are intended to look very dignified. Think about courthouses, churches, some financial institutions. They may look like Greek temples. They have columns of the same style. They have attics or pediments, that is, the thing supported by the columns, in the same way that Greek temples did. It's kind of gotten into our psyche that that sort of a structure means dignity and power. The Supreme Court is an excellent example of this. It's the highest court in the land, and the building looks like a Greek temple. Now, lastly, let's move on to the Roman Empire. There's a couple of unique things about Rome. Of course, they were great in civil engineering. But let's talk about the purpose, first of all, of sculpture, because they created sculpture as well. In many cases, the sculpture was used to identify individuals, and in this way, it departed a great deal from Greek sculpture. Instead of being idealized and beautiful, when the Romans created a statue of the emperor, they wanted you to recognize the emperor. If he came to town, they wanted you to know who he was. But if he didn't come to town, they still wanted you to know what he looked like. And they made the statue realistic. So many people are not perfectly proportioned, and they don't necessarily have the most handsome faces. And if that was the case with an emperor, that's the way he was pictured in stone. Rome adopted Christianity around 312 AD. After that time, we call it Christianized Rome. The art was used to tell religious stories for the benefit of people who couldn't read. We'll later get on into the Byzantine era, after 600, where a controversy develops. Should churches have decoration at all? That is, images of people, perhaps saints, or Jesus, or the Virgin Mary. At the time, a lot of people were being converted from pagan religions to Christianity, and some people thought that this artwork might in itself be, as the Greeks thought that the artwork was the deity and worshipped it, that pagans being converted to Christianity might worship the idol, that is, the image, rather than what the image represents. So, one of the rules in creating artwork for Christianized Rome was that in telling the story, that is a religious story or picturing an event, you don't make the picture any more beautiful or artful than necessary to convey the story. Beauty might be distracting. This is, of course, in strong opposition to the Greek way of creating statuary, was to make it idealized beauty of the human form. In terms of technology, we find some attempts at linear perspective in wall paintings, but no methodical basis for it. Although the attempt was made to show distance with buildings that recede into the distance or converging lines, it wasn't done with the necessary logic to make it hang together well. It was an attempt, but they hadn't yet worked out how linear perspective really works. The Romans did use mixtures of compounds, and they recognized that many times the compounds they were using were toxic because they contained mercury or arsenic for reds and yellows. But they had no choice. If those were the only types of pigments available, they used them and put up with the fact that the substance was rather dangerous and was, in some cases, if contact between people and those substances was too great, people might die. So obviously they didn't lick their brushes when they painted these kinds of decorations on walls. They were rather careful with it. But it was only in much later times that safer pigments became available as a result in the 1800s of organic chemistry, way after the Roman era. We did find that mechanical drills were used to speed up the creation of sculpture, and that was at the expense of the quality of the craftsmanship. So at this point, some of the fine points of making statues and artwork were lost because the artwork had to be created in such quantity or so quickly that shortcuts were taken, such as this. Now, what is the impact? Well, one impact of art on modern life is that art technology was refined and extended to create structures that we sometimes don't regard as artful types of creations. Aqueducts, but dome buildings we would regard perhaps as a very monumental type of an artful structure. The arch was critical in the formation of these things, but when the arch was adapted by turning it on its side to support a dome that might be constructed without internal supports, it went beyond what the simple arch does. This was refined only 1,000 years later, after the creation of the Pantheon. But the Pantheon in Rome stood as a monumental dome and still stands as a monumental dome that shows a high degree of perfection and development that the Romans made in the area of civil engineering to use structures in such a way as to create these very large buildings with the arch and with the arch adapted to a dome. Later civilizations benefited from these developments. And those are the highlights that I think it's important for you to understand for USF1.